Hello, and welcome to my channel. This is Game Tender, and today I will be looking at horror games from one of my favorite developers of recent years, Supermassive Games. I will be ranking them from my least favorite to the ones I think are the very best Supermassive has to offer. For those of you unfamiliar with Supermassive Games, this England-based studio is best known for its horror games, mainly their breakthrough title Until Dawn, which was followed by multiple other games from the same genre. They also did release a bunch of other titles, as well as DLCs for Little Big Planet, but they didn't really get much recognition prior to the 2015 release of Until Dawn, which established the direction that Supermassive Games took after that. Their horror games more or less resemble interactive movies, where your decisions directly impact the story and potential survival or death of your characters. Aside from walking around, exploring, and occasional QTEs, you won't find much actual gameplay in these games. At least that goes for the majority of them, but more about that later. Let me just get one thing off the way before we dive in. I will be ranking these games based on how much I personally enjoyed playing through them, so if you don't agree with me, that's completely understandable as we all have different preferences. By now, I have finished most of Supermassive Games multiple times, and although I had fun with all of them, there are some that I enjoyed way more than the others. I won't be including the two Until Dawn spin-offs for VR, as they don't really fit among the other games that we will talk about in this video. Well, I think that's pretty much it, and we can move on to the first game on the list, which I consider my least favorite of all Supermassive horror titles. Number 7. The Casting of Frank Stone. Supermassive's latest release is also my least favorite game on this list. The casting of Frank Stone is set within the Dead by Daylight universe and spread across two timelines, well, three if you count the prologue. The game opens with a police officer in search of a missing child, and we are introduced to one of the two main locations of the game, Cedar Steel Mill, and to a killer named Frank Stone. The events of the prologue will then lead to the two timelines I mentioned earlier. The first one is set in year 1980. 17 years after the prologue, with a couple of teenagers filming a horror movie at now abandoned mill. The second timeline is set in 2024, and it will take us to the Geran Manor, where a group of people is invited by a mysterious collector named Augustine Lieber. Both timelines are connected, and there are definitely some interesting twists in the story. Similar to Devil in Me, which was the last entry in the Dark Pictures anthology, this game also contains more gameplay mechanics than some other games on this list. Why is this my least favorite game on the list then? Well, it's mainly because there's just nothing happening for about 80% of the game between the prologue and the final part. Don't get me wrong, all Supermassive games tend to have slow build-up before the story really gets going, but in this case, it simply takes too much time. And as original as the story was, I can't say I enjoyed it all that much. But I have to mention that this game was mainly aimed at Dead by Daylight fans, and if you are one of them, I'm sure you'll enjoy the casting of Frank Stone more than I did. Number 6. Little Hope. The second entry in the Dark Pictures anthology takes us to the present-day ghost town called Little Hope, where a group of students and their teacher are desperately looking for help after their bus crashes near the town. As far as different timelines go, portions of the game are also set during the 17th century witch trials that took place in the area, while the prologue takes us to 1970s. Gameplay-wise, Little Hope plays the same way as the first episode of Dark Pictures anthology, Men of Medan, but the locations are a bit more open, which makes sense considering the game is taking place in a ghost town. And speaking of the town, I really like the atmosphere of the small abandoned town that kind of reminded me of Silent Hill. Overall though, I think this is the weakest entry in the Dark Pictures anthology. I found most of the characters in this game extremely unlikable, and the story and plot twist didn't really sit with me. Also, this game had probably the most controversial ending of the entire anthology, but if you haven't played it yet, I won't spoil it for you. Let's just say that the fans were left divided. Number 5. Man of Medan. Man of Medan was the first game in the Dark Pictures anthology, and its story takes us to the Pacific Ocean, where a diving expedition goes wrong. After discovering a Second World War plane wreck, the divers and captain of a small vessel are taken hostage by a dodgy fisherman, and they all end up on board of a ghost ship that went missing after World War II. Just like with most of the other games on this list, there is also a short prologue set just before the ship's disappearance. I have to say that the part of the game that takes place after the prologue is painfully boring. But once you get to the actual ghost ship, well, that's where the game really shines. Wandering through the old rusty corridors of a vessel that's been drifting on the ocean for some 70 years while trying to avoid the kidnappers and uncovering what the hell is wrong with this ship? Yes please. The setting combined with a more interesting story and slightly more likable characters than the ones in Little Hope. These are the reasons why I enjoy the game a bit more than the second entry in the Dark Pictures anthology. Number 4. The Devil in Me. The final entry in the first season of Dark Pictures anthology, and also the one that comes with the biggest innovations, such as more actual gameplay, puzzle solving, and inventory. After the prologue, set in 1893, we are taken to a modern-day replica of H.H. Holmes's murder castle, where a group of filmmakers has been invited by a strange estate owner. As you probably already guessed, things will go different direction than the crew anticipated. They will end up being trapped inside a house full of dangers and secret doors with a mysterious killer on the loose. The characters are pretty good in this one, and it has some of the most brutal choices of the entire series. I was slightly disappointed by the ending, as I felt like figuring out who the killer is was just too easy, and I was kind of expecting some huge twist in the end, but it never happened. Apart from that, I felt like this was a great game, and I enjoyed the new gameplay features introduced in The Devil in Me that took the whole series in a new direction. I can't wait to see what will Supermassive Games come up with in the new season of the Dark Pictures anthology. Number 3. House of Ashes. As much as I enjoyed The Devil in Me, I'll have to go with House of Ashes as my personal favorite game in the Dark Pictures anthology. After a short and intense prologue that takes place in Mesopotamia around 2000 BC, we switch to 2003. The game takes place during the US invasion of Iraq, and we're quickly introduced to a bunch of American soldiers as well as members of the Iraqi Republican Guard. It doesn't take long before the protagonists of the game are trapped inside an ancient underground temple with terrifying creatures lurking in the dark. The story and atmosphere of the House of Ashes are simply great, and I enjoyed every second of uncovering the secrets of the temple all the way to the grand finale. The characters are also the best in the entire anthology, and the whole enemy of my enemy theme works great in my opinion. As for the gameplay, while House of Ashes saw minor improvements in certain mechanics, mainly the camera, it still plays more or less the same as the first two titles in the anthology, unlike The Devil in Me, which introduced some significant changes to the gameplay. And with the entire Dark Pictures anthology and the casting of Frank Stone behind us, there are 2 games left on the list. Number 2. The Quarry. The Quarry dropped almost out of the blue. It was both announced and released within a very short period of time, and just 5 months before the last game from the Dark Pictures anthology arrived. The story takes us to the Hackett's Quarry. After a quick prologue, we fast forward 2 months, and we are introduced to a bunch of teenage camp counselors who have just closed the camp as the summer is over, and they are ready to depart. Unfortunately for them, they are forced to spend one more night in the camp, and despite being told to stay at the lodge and not leave under any circumstances, the group decides to throw a bonfire party instead. As you probably guessed by now, things will take a dark turn, and the counselors will experience a night full of horrors in the camp and surrounding areas. Now, this game is the closest it gets to Until Dawn, whether it's the characters, location, story, or the length of the game. This is simply Supermassive Games doing what they do the best. The Quarry is a love letter to 80s horror movies like Friday the 13th, and I had a great time playing through it. But there can only be one king. Number 1. Until Dawn. The game that started it all. I think that the majority of players will agree with me when I say that the first horror game that made the Supermassive game so popular is also their best title to date. It's also one that I replayed the most times, and I enjoyed it every single time even though I already know the story inside out. The game takes place at the lodge and surrounding areas on Blackwood Mountain, where a bunch of friends are reunited 1 year after a horrible tragedy took place there, as we can see in the prologue. And of course, the night doesn't go exactly the way they expected. Will they survive until dawn? That's entirely up to you. With Until Dawn, Supermassive Games discovered the formula that they have been using ever since, but none of their other games has surpassed their first horror title yet. But who knows, the second season of the Dark Pictures anthology is just around the corner, with the first episode being released at some point this year. So, this is my ranking of the Supermassive horror games. I'm sure some of you might highly disagree with me, and I'd be curious to see how would you rank these games. Let me know in the comment section. Thank you for watching, until the next time.